Welcome to the course of IoT Lab. In today's session, we are going to learn an experiment theoretically, which is titled as Experiment on HTTP to CoAP Semantic Mapping Proxy in IoT Toolkit. Okay, so why a proxy is used between the HTTP and CoAP, and what actually does a proxy do? Okay, and we are going to see each and everything. So coming to the aim of this experiment, we are going to write and explain the working of an HTTP to CoAP semantic mapping proxy in IoT Toolkit. So the point of the draft, the main aim of the experiment is to describe how to do HTTP to CoAP mapping in order to allow HTTP clients to access a CoAP server through a proxy. Now, this works in such a way that though the similarities between CoAP and HTTP exists, not all browser will implement or support for it. Okay, so some devices need proxying. So most of the IoT devices will work with respect to the HTTP as well as CoAP, but some will be using the help of proxy in order to establish a communication between HTTP and CoAP, though both are having more similarities. Now, next assumption is like the users will like to use their smartphones for their home sensors. Let's say they are using an home automation setup. Okay, so most of the users will be able or need to use their smartphones itself in order to use the sensors integrated to that IoT device in the home. So every time, if at all you want to access the data between HTTP and CoAP, we need to go for the proxy. And this is a basic block diagram how an proxy effectively work between the HTTP as well as CoAP. So if you see here, we have an HTTP client as well as in the HTTP client, we have a browser, and this uses a proxy which will be helping in mapping the particular data from the CoAP server to the HTTP client. And the third segment is like the CoAP server, and this is where all the sensor data can be loaded or fetched. Okay, so these are the three partitions: HTTP client, which is through the server, and the proxy, which is does the mapping, and the CoAP server, which will be having the data with respect to the sensors. Now, coming to the HTTP to CoAP proxy, this for this we are using an HC proxy, which is accessed by an HTTP client, which want to access the source of a CoAP server. Okay. Now this HC proxy handles the HTTP request by mapping it to the equivalent CoAP request. So further it is forwarded to the CoAP server. Now, once the CoAP receives the response, then it is mapped through an appropriate HTTP response, and it is finally sent to the HTTP client. So I will be also showing you the architecture or a simple mapping how it is done. Now here the proxy is located at the boundary of the constrained domain in order to avoid the HTTP traffic. So it can be HTTP traffic is like avoiding any unsecured or any kind of data. Okay. Now this particular a DNS server is used by the HTTP client to resolve the IP address of the HTTP proxy, and optionally it also uses the HC proxy to resolve the IP addresses of CoAP servers. Both the this thing IP address of the CoAP servers and IP address of the HC proxy is used by the client, HTTP client, to resolve this particular thing. So if you see the things over here, we have an HTTP client, and from here it goes to the HTTP request. From here, as we are using proxy will be helping in mapping the HTTP to CoAP. Now the proxy will be sending the CoAP request to the CoAP server, And once the CoAP server fetch the required data, that will be going to the proxy again in the form of a CoAP response. And from the once the proxy receives the CoAP response, that will be again converted into HTTP response, and again it goes to the HTTP client. This is how a proxy maps between the HTTP as well as CoAP. Both are the protocols, hypertext as well as the constraint protocols, which will be taking the help of proxy for mapping these two protocols. So this is the proxy development or proxy deployment scenario between those two protocols. Now coming to the basic block diagram, if you see CoAP and HTTP, we have CoAP request and HTTP response handler, and we have an HTTP module which will be having CoAP HTTP mapping, HTTP parser, HTTP client, and TCP client. Okay, from here we have this RI and CA, which these are not much important, but where as have this block diagram just showing you that the main thing is how the proxy is mapped between the HTTP and CoAP, that should be considered. Okay, so we have CA message handler, CA connectivity manager, Bluetooth modules, all these hardware related, which will be with respect to the CoAP client. Okay, so you can see the color coding over here. This color indicates the modified component. The blue color will be indicating the new component and all those things. Now, let's see what are these CoAP to HTTP mapping. It is nothing but it contains the mapping between CoAP and HTTP requests, response, and error codes. Okay, now CoAP request to HTTP response handler, it implements conversation of CoAP request to HTTP request and HTTP response to CoAP response with the help of CoAP HTTP mapping module. And we have these three terms over here. HTTP parser, it implements the functionality of parsing HTTP responses. HTTP client, it implements the functionality of generating HTTP request, and TCP client, it implements the TCP client to interact with the HTTP servers. Okay, so this is the overview how a mapping is done using the proxy between the HTTP client and CoAP server.